when we were putting this together, we really wanted to understand, like I said, issues that are out in front that employers and maybe employees are struggling with. And if you pick up a paper on any given day, you know that the opioid crisis is having an impact on multiple people, not just employees, but also the employer. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn. Hopefully Eric didn't break the clicker and it only goes one slide at once. And she's going to talk about opioids and the role of the EAP. Just quick show of hands from an employer standpoint. How many of you have an EAP in place right now? Okay, great. With that, I'll turn it over to Carolyn.
I'm not sure. Can you hear me if I don't have the microphone? I tend to walk around a lot. Is that okay?
You
Is
can
it
just
off?
turn it off.
I'm going to turn it off for me. So I don't.
It's better for the
Okay.
video.
Yeah, if you can't hear me, I'll take the microphone, but I tend to walk around a lot. So thank you so much for being here and for spending time with us this morning talking about some very important topics. My name is Carolyn Lamparella. I'm the director for Preferred EAP. We are owned and operated by Lehigh Valley Health Network. They are our major employer that we provide service for, but we also provide service for more than 50 companies, large and small, across the Lehigh Valley. So, you know, Lehigh Valley Health Network has about 14,000 employees, and we work with, you know, companies of that size, but we also work with companies who have 10 employees. So that's one of the nice things about Preferred EAP is we are very customizable. So let me ask you a question. How many in this room have heard of the opioid epidemic? Right? We all have heard more than we want to hear about this epidemic. How many of you, and you don't have to, I'm not going to ask for details, how many of you have been personally impacted in some way by the opioid epidemic? Personally, whether you've experienced it yourself, have a family member, know somebody, right? Most of us have been touched in some way by the opioid epidemic, which, you know, about 10 years ago, we weren't even really thinking about it. And I wanted to just start off by telling you a little bit about my own history with becoming aware of the opioid epidemic. About 10 years ago, I was sitting at my brother-in-law's funeral, who drank himself to death, you know, talking about alcohol abuse and alcoholism and what a terrible disease it is. And while I'm sitting there, I'm talking to my husband's uncle who lives in a very affluent neighborhood in Chicago. And he's telling us about his teenage son who, you know, is a great kid. He grew up in a great schools, really had a promising future. And he's telling us about how he's addicted to heroin. I was like, what? This was about 10 years ago. We weren't talking about this at all. I'm like, heroin? How is that possible? You know, and sure enough, you know, later on we learned that that's actually that area where he lived is where the opioid epidemic really began. You know, we were starting to see, you know, heroin spreading, you know, beginning in that suburb in Chicago. So now I'm aware that this could be a potential problem. It's impacted my family. And now, as a counselor at EAP, I'm hearing more and more and more stories from clients whose teenagers are addicted to heroin. And I'm thinking, what is going on here? You know, how is this possible? Well, fast forward to about 3 years ago, my teenage son starts dabbling a little bit with marijuana, goes to a good school in the Lehigh Valley, you know. It's known for its academics, fairly affluent neighborhood. About 3 years ago, we came to discover that he was addicted to Xanax. He's in 10th grade. He's addicted to Xanax. How does this happen? How does this happen? So, you know, fortunately for us, we had the resources where we were able to send him to rehab so that he could be detoxed from Xanax. And while he was in rehab, I asked him, the school was very slow to have a community meeting to discuss, this problem. They were one of the last schools to gather the community together to talk about, hey, I think we have a problem here in the school. And I asked my son, what do you want me to share in this meeting? It was a large community meeting. And he said, Mom, I want you to tell them that everything I learned about drugs, I learned at the lunch table. And every single solitary pill that he ever put inside his body, he got at the lunch table in school. So one of the reasons that I'm sharing this story is because in my experience, when we start getting bombarded with information about the opioid crisis, we sort of get numb to it, and we start to be like, oh yeah, more statistics, more this, more that, and we forget that this is a very real problem. The good news is my son actually got the help that he needed at the time that he needed it most, and we were very fortunate. But most people don't have those kind of resources, or most people don't recognize the problem. I'm a trained therapist, so fortunately for me, I was able to see it, and identify it early. But one of the reasons I'm emphasizing that is because you are all in the best position possible to help employees deal with their own problem with opioids. Because for some reason, it takes us having, an employer say to us, okay, there's a problem here and you need to get help, before most people will go get help. If their job is impacted, they're more than likely to pursue treatment. And sometimes it takes employer intervention in order to make that happen. So, moving on, let's see if this works. So just to give you, I'm sure you've all heard these statistics, and there's new statistics coming out every single day, but the one that I thought was really shocking. The good news is that now that doctors they're putting stricter guidelines in place for prescribing, that we actually have seen a decline in opioid prescriptions. It's starting to decrease a little bit. But in 2015, the amount of opioids prescribed was enough for every American to be medicated around the clock for 3 weeks. That's insane. Are we really, as a society, are Americans in that much more pain than anybody else? Think about it. How many of you saw the 60 Minutes episode on the opioid crisis? If you haven't seen it, I really encourage you to watch it, because the prescription opioids, the problem really emerged from this increase in prescriptions that are written. And then we now know from this report, with the Washington Post and 60 Minutes, did this investigative report that showed that Congress actually passed a law that limited the DEA's ability to intervene with the drug distributors who are sending, an ungodly amount of prescriptions to that are winding up on the black market, right? And they told the story in the 60 Minutes episode about a small town in West Virginia that has 300 people and received 1 million prescriptions or something ridiculous like that of opioids. They have 300 people. How is that not going to wind up on the black market? So, if you look, a lot of us know and have heard that Pennsylvania is really a significant corridor, and we are really struggling. And you can see from this map that we are one of the highest states when it comes to prescriptions written for opioids. So Pennsylvania has a real problem. And this is something else that was kind of surprising to me. Where are people getting their opioids? By far, people are getting them from friends or relatives for free. And why is that? It's because they're being overprescribed. Doctors are prescribing 90 pills at a time. My son told me that in his school, this was actually fortunate because of it, that it wasn't opioids. But he said one of the reasons that Xanax was such a problem in the high school was because of the way it's prescribed. People get 90 pills at a time. 90 pills. And what happens is they wind up in the medicine cabinet, unused, And then it goes from the medicine cabinet into the hands of these teenagers, and then it gets distributed. And that's why we have such a problem with overdoses among young adults. So the opioids continue, the prescribing practices continue to fuel the epidemic, and in 2015 more than 15,000 people died from prescription opioids. 91 Americans a day. And I think that's actually gone up. I think I heard a statistic that it's more like over 100. People die every day from opioid abuse. I'm sorry, Eric was making you laugh. I'm going to make you depressed. So we'll all need a little coffee on the way out, you know?
All that medical marijuana.
Yeah, right. We're going to apply for our cards, right? Okay. So, and just this graph just kind of shows you the trends, which we all are pretty aware of. So, I mostly want to talk to you about the role that your EAP can serve in helping you deal with employees who are struggling. But I couldn't go forward without at least giving you some idea of what to look for, the physical signs of opioid abuse, because part of the problem is it's often masked by other things. And I want everyone to be, if nothing else, I want all of you to be much more aware of possible symptoms, of an employee who's struggling. So elation, euphoria, sedation, drowsiness. This is what we hear most of the time at EAP. That's the biggest complaint. That gets them sent to employee health. They're falling asleep on the job. We notice that they're a little bit drowsy. Confusion. They're not really making sense. They're saying some things and they're not really making sense. That warrants a referral to employee health. Employee health does drug testing and finds not just opioids in their system, but you name it. I mean, these individuals are so overprescribed. And they may be taking their medication as prescribed, which most of them are. But because they're going to so many different doctors, and doctors do not communicate with one another, these people are over-medicated. And so we uncover a lot of that in our EAP. When we do our evaluation, we actually spend the time talking to each doctor, and we say, hey, do you know that what this doctor's prescribing? And often they don't, especially if they're not on electronic medical records. That's when an employee can really kind of go around and do the doctor shopping, which is one of the signs of opioid abuse, is doctor shopping. Changing moods, pill bottles showing up in the trash. That was actually something that tuned us in. To my son, all of a sudden, I was discovering, pills that I was like, what is this? Is this ibuprofen? Is this, or little baggies, or things like that? Social withdrawal and isolation, sudden financial problems. That's often because, these pills are expensive. Once they run out and they're no longer able to get a prescription, going to the black market to buy an opiate is very expensive, which is why heroin has become so popular, because it's so cheap in comparison. Withdrawal symptoms. Again, this often gets misdiagnosed because it looks like the flu. People, if you see that somebody is out often and they're complaining of flu-like symptoms and it's happening quite frequently, that's a red flag. You don't want to ignore that. You don't want to assume that they're just, under the weather. I had an employer recently reach out to us. It was a very small employer. They don't have an EAP. And he was desperate. One of the owners called me and said, can you please come and talk to us? And when I got there, he was talking about one of his prize employees, like his most valued employee. And it's a very technical employer, so it would be nearly impossible to replace this guy. But he had gone through a divorce, and he had an injury, had a back injury, and started being absent a little bit more, complaining about not feeling well, and before you know it, he was out for 3 months. And it took the employer 3 months to finally get somebody in to get some help. And we immediately, fortunately, he was very motivated and he wanted help. he was, abusing alcohol. He was abusing opioid prescriptions. He was, going through a divorce, so he was becoming more and more socially isolated. We got involved. We did an assessment. We got him into treatment right away. And he detoxed. He went through treatment, and then when he left, he went into a halfway house, and now he's back at work. And we, as an EAP, one of the things that we are committed to is following him. So we keep checking in, for at least a year to make sure that he's still doing well, that he's not, experiencing too much stress, that he's following up with his treatment provider. That's critical. That's critical, and that you should expect from your EAP. Because part of the problem is when people go back to work and the stress returns, the risk of returning to those, alcohol is probably the number one problem that we're dealing with. But, alcohol and returning to the prescription opioids is the risk is very high. So you really want to make sure that they're being monitored. So what is the impact on employers? How many of you, as part of your role as with your employer, have you dealt with this issue? How many of you? Not too many. Okay. So the estimate is about 70% of employers are impacted in some way. And frankly, a lot of employers don't know they're impacted because, again, the problem is masked so well by other things, But if you're seeing an increase in absenteeism, and what we call presenteeism, that's where the real cost comes in. And the estimate is that employers are being impacted to the tune of $442 billion a year through lost, productivity, absenteeism, presenteeism. Individuals who are there but aren't really there. And we're seeing a lot of that. A benefits platform called Castlight Health, I don't know if you've ever heard of them. They did a study recently where they aggregated pharmacy and medical data to take a closer look at what's happening with the opioid crisis. And they estimate that an employee who is abusing opioids costs twice as much in healthcare expenses as somebody who is not abusing. This is another interesting fact that the opioid use may be accounting for 1/5 of the decline of men in the workforce. That's pretty unbelievable. Okay. So what can an employer do? There is good news. As I said before, what we are finding is that once an employer mandates an employee to get an assessment, to get help, their prognosis is so much better than if they come voluntarily. Because most of these people really want to keep their job. It's amazing that motivates them more than anything. And so you are really in the best position to help these individuals as an employer. So that's the good news. So what is important for you to have in place? With medical marijuana, I'm sure that everyone is reevaluating their workplace drug and alcohol policies. I know we are at the Health Network. We have a whole committee working on medical marijuana. But what about prescriptions? We tend to sort of dismiss, they're taking it as prescribed. But what we know about these opioids is, do you really want somebody in a safety-sensitive position taking opioids? They're taking it as prescribed, but it still has an impact. It still has an effect. And the risk of abuse is so much greater. One interesting thing that Castlight Health found was that states that had medical marijuana laws had lower rates of opioid abuse. That's actually very promising. That's hopeful. But part of the problem is that marijuana stays in your system for so much longer. I know at the Health Network, when we have somebody who tests positive for marijuana, they have to be out of work most of the time for about 30 days before they can return, because they have to test negative before they come back to work. And it takes about that long sometimes for it to leave their system. So one of the most important things you can do is to evaluate your workplace policy and make sure that you're addressing prescriptions. You know, most employers won't even touch that. They'll say, well, it's prescribed. I have to let them take it. You know, yes and no. I mean, yes, you have to follow the ADA laws, and you have to make reasonable accommodations for somebody who truly is dealing with chronic pain or a condition that requires them to take these medications. But, you know, often they're not taking them as prescribed, they're abusing them, and you can have a workplace policy that addresses that. The National Safety Council, if you haven't looked at their website, they have wonderful information for employers to help guide your writing of new policy. They even have a sample, a paragraph that you can sort of copy about how to address, you know, the use of prescription medications. So you want to make sure that your workplace policies address this. You also want to make sure that when you do drug testing, that it covers, you know, the typical drug panel doesn't cover certain opioids. So you want to make sure that you have a much more comprehensive drug panel that is done, you know, for your employees. Education. This is really important. You know, educating your employees about your drug, you know, your workplace policies, your drug and alcohol policies. Educating managers, educating supervisors. They should be talking about these policies frequently because we forget. You know, we get complacent and we forget. We were working with, at EAP, we had a med student. This might be a little scary for you. But anyway, the med student was talking about how she smokes pot almost every day to deal with the anxiety of, you know, of med school. And she said, well, everybody does it. They're all doing it. I'm like, well, that's really freaking terrifying, you know? And part of the problem is, you know, we are in the role at EAP. We educate them. We say, do you realize what the policy is here? Do you understand the potential impact of you testing positive? All it takes is somebody to say, so-and-so is smoking pot every day. That's reasonable suspicion. Now you're going to be referred for testing. You know, we need to be talking about this with employees. They need to understand that we're paying attention. And the best way to do that is to make it part of your routine conversation, routine interaction with your employees, whenever you can. So partnering with an EAP. So how many of you have an EAP? Okay, what would you say your utilization rate is for EAP? Give me throw out a number. What percentage of your employees use the service? How many think it's like 10%? How many think it's less than 10%? It's generally about 1%. 1 to 3% across the board. Now, is that because you have really, really healthy people working for you? No, probably not, right? Part of the problem with having an EAP is there is some attitude of complacency. Well, we have an EAP. We post information, we put information around. You know, we have posters, right? They should know. But the problem with that is, you know, we all know there's a stigma associated with going to EAP, right? Everyone talks about the stigma of mental health. Well, if you go to EAP, it's because you're in trouble, you know, because there's something wrong. We need to change that. If we want to address this opioid problem, we have to make EAP part of our everyday conversation. We need to be talking to employees. We need to have EAP providers on site educating. What I always tell my customers is if you bring me out and do a training at your location, I guarantee you that the referrals will increase. And almost always, the day after I do a presentation, I get 3 or 4 phone calls. You know, I've been meaning to call you guys, and I didn't really know that you did this. And, you know, so education is absolutely critical. You have to make sure that your managers and supervisors are comfortable referring employees. If they're not comfortable, it's not going to happen. I worked with a company recently where there was an individual, it's a very sad story really, there was an individual who spoke to several coworkers about wanting to kill himself. And this was a guy who was just happy-go-lucky. He was just a really good guy, and nobody ever expected him to be struggling in this way. And he told 2 or 3 people who coached him and counseled him and tried to help him, and, you know, didn't tell anybody else, didn't tell their employer, didn't report it to anybody, and sure enough, he killed himself. And we were brought in to deal with the fallout. But these individuals who he was speaking to weren't comfortable with the idea of saying, hey, you need to go to EAP. You know, let me call them right now. We've got to get people comfortable doing that, because you may not know that one of your employees is struggling with opioid abuse, but I guarantee you their coworkers know. Somebody knows. And we have to make sure that they are comfortable calling somebody. Because what I know about opioid abuse is the sooner you get in, the sooner you're going to be able to get help, and the less likely you are to have a problem. And you certainly are less likely to have an overdose. I know that's you know, by the grace of God, we were able to get my son into treatment right away. Had we not, I don't want to know what, you know, would have happened, because in the treatment program, his outpatient treatment program, since we've been involved for the past 3 years, we've lost 3 kids already to overdose. You know, so it's going to happen. It's a matter of when, you know, if somebody is abusing opioids. So getting in there early is really, really critical. The other thing to emphasize is the confidentiality of EAP services. You know, most people are, you know, feel like we always tell people that we're not even on electronic medical records. We keep paper charts, which we love, and we don't want to change. You know, but we emphasize the confidentiality. The only time it's not confidential is when you mandate somebody to come to EAP. When you mandate them, they test positive for drugs or alcohol, and you require them to go. But even in those circumstances, there's a release of information in place. And we are very strict about that. And mental health has very strict guidelines about what can be shared. You know, so you want to emphasize that with your employees. And again, do not wait to refer. So what happens after an employee tests positive? Let me just take a peek at my time here. Okay, got a couple minutes. So what we do at EAP, so I'll just give you a typical example. Somebody gets referred to employee health through our health network. They see a doctor. They're sent for drug and alcohol testing if there's reasonable suspicion. They test positive, and then they get a referral to EAP. We have 2 individuals that are substance abuse professionals, DOT certified, on staff, who will do an evaluation, a drug and an alcohol assessment, and then we refer for treatment. And we have connections with treatment providers, and your EAP providers should have connections with treatment programs. They should know where to send somebody. And we make the transfer, and then we monitor them. We talk to the treatment provider, we gather the information, we make sure that they're getting the help that they need. Once they are discharged, we have return to work meetings. You know, we sit down with the employee and the employer, and we help them establish a contract, you know, that they must follow once they return to work. And then we as an EAP will continue to check in with them. Sometimes they're referred to outpatient counseling, and so we will just be in touch with the outpatient counselor to make sure they're attending and that they're actually doing well. And we will stay with them for at least a year, you know, and longer if necessary, because relapse is often part of this process. And if they relapse, we just start all over again. But partnering with your EAP is critical, because the cost of replacing an employee is much higher than the cost of treating that employee, of providing them with treatment. And so you want to make sure that the benefit package that you're offering employees includes good drug and alcohol treatment. It's really critical. It's really critical because it does work. It really does work. So I just wanted to kind of tune you into this website, the National Safety Council. They have a whole prescription drug employer kit. If you haven't looked at their website, if you need some guidance about, you know, your workplace policies, I encourage you to take a look at it and to get some assistance there. But if you ever have any questions, you are certainly welcome to give me a call. Even if we're not your EAP, we work with anybody who calls. You know, anybody who has questions, we are certainly there to help you out. So, any questions? That was quick and dirty. So, hopefully not too depressed. But I want to leave you with some hope. You know, I really want to leave you with some hope because we are starting to get ahead of this problem, and employers are starting to really get more involved, which is really critical. So, thank you. Does anybody have any questions? All right, thank you so much.
Carolyn. Again, we know this is an investment of your time. Hopefully, we gave you some good information that you can go back and use within your organizations. Like I said at the beginning of the presentation, we have a very good panel of experts. If you want to engage with any one of them, feel free to reach out to me or any one of your contacts at Univest, and we'll be happy to coordinate that discussion. One of the things that Carolyn said, and we find this comes up pretty regularly with employers, is that you're spending a lot of money on your benefits program. And I think a lot of employers right now are figuring out, how do I better engage my employees so that they really understand the value of the benefit package we're providing to them, but also, to Carolyn's point, how to best utilize that when it's appropriate. So we think that that's a really important piece with the employer-employee relationship. And if you ever need ideas on how we do that, we're happy to share it with you. Again, we thank you for attending. You get an extra 15 minutes in your day. Well done, panelists. We'll send this out early next week, and we appreciate your time in attending. Have a great day. Thank you.